He was the world's most wanted man, and now he's dead. The leader of Daesh blew himself up after U.S. forces stormed his safe house in northwestern Syria. It's a blow to the group, but does it mean their threat of terror is over for good? I'm Omran Center, and today's newsmaker is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He declared himself the leader of an Islamic state, and soon Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his brutal terror group controlled territory the size of Great Britain. For years, Daesh ruled large parts of Iraq and Syria, murdering and torturing any who opposed them. But soon, the militants began to lose control. Now they've lost their leader too, killed in Idlib, just a few kilometers from the Turkish border, in a raid by U.S. forces. But the Americans couldn't do it alone. Following the operation, the U.S. president thanked Turkey, Russia, Syria and Iraq for their cooperation. Trump might have got Baghdadi, but nobody so far has been able to attain peace. And as Haider Abbasi explains, the war in Syria is far from over.
These are the remains of the home belonging to the most wanted man in the world. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was targeted in a raid by U.S. Special Forces in Syria. The self-described caliph and leader of Daesh had nowhere to run. According to the White House, Baghdadi went down a dead-end tunnel connected to the house.
He ignited his vest, killing himself and the 3 children. His body was mutilated by the blast. The tunnel had caved in on it in addition. But test results gave certain, immediate, and totally positive identification. It was him.
The leader of what was once the most feared terror group in the world is dead. President Donald Trump says no U.S. personnel were killed or wounded during the operation. But according to Trump, 2 of Baghdadi's wives were found dead and 11 children were detained. The president says U.S. intelligence agencies had been watching Baghdadi for 2 weeks before the raid. The Daesh leader was killed near the remote village of Barisha in Syria's northwestern province of Idlib, about 5 kilometers south of Turkey's border. The location is important because Idlib is controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, fighters opposed to Syria's Bashar al-Assad. They're also fierce rivals of Daesh. Baghdadi declared his so-called caliphate in 2014 after his men captured the Iraqi city of Mosul. From there, the terror group quickly expanded. By 2015, Daesh controlled vast areas of Iraq and Syria, around 88,000 square kilometers. It ruled over 1 million people. But after an operation was launched by an international coalition to defeat the terror group, its territory was reduced to a pocket of land in eastern Syria. In March, its so-called caliphate was wiped out. Daesh became infamous for its brutality, beheading prisoners of war, burning captives alive, enslaving minority communities, and inspiring terror attacks across the world. The death of Baghdadi ends one chapter in the war in Syria, but another has already begun. These are Assad's soldiers arriving in Ain al-Arab. They haven't been seen here since they lost control of the northern city in 2012. The YPG terror group had held it, but it turned to the Syrian regime in desperation after Turkey moved into its territory. In just a few days, Turkey's army forced out the terror group from towns and villages. Ankara says the YPG is a threat to its national security and wants to create a safe zone along its border with Syria. But a pause in the fighting was agreed, and Turkey negotiated a deal with Syria's powerful ally, Russia. Russia and Turkey will now patrol border towns in northern Syria. The return of the regime in northern Syria has been made easier by the US decision to withdraw its troops from the region. Since 2017, American soldiers had patrolled Manbij and other areas. But that void has now been filled by Russia. Will this now help Moscow to extend its influence over Syria and Turkey? And what could this mean for relations between Turkey and its NATO allies? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Ankara is Murat Aslan. He led the intelligence division of the Turkish Armed Forces and is now a security researcher at the SETA Foundation. Sergei Markov is in Moscow. He's a former Russian MP and was a spokesman for President Vladimir Putin. In New York is lawyer Dave Jonas. He worked on nuclear non-proliferation for the Pentagon under the Bush administration, and Donald Trump nominated him to be the Energy Department's legal counsel. And with me on set is Yaser Tabbara. He's a senior fellow at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies and a former spokesman for the opposition Syrian interim government. Gentlemen, good to have you all on the program. And let me just say from the outset, my apologies in advance if I have to interrupt. Time is our enemy. Yaser Tabbara, how do you feel as a Syrian? Baghdadi is dead. Any relief, any consolation?
Well, there's no question about it. Good riddance. Let's be very, very clear. This is a man who brought much destruction to Syria, directly or indirectly, mostly indirectly. And I say that because we have to keep things in a larger context, which is with all of the criminality and the rotten ideology that al-Baghdadi and ISIS brought to this world, they are still responsible for directly responsible for less than 2 or 3% of the number of victims in Syria. The Assad regime being the main culprit behind more than 90% of the death and destruction of Syrians and Syrian lives and Syrian infrastructure in Syrian cities. And so for us, we've always seen that ISIS and Baghdadi and other types of groups have always been used as a sort of a way to get in and to sort of interfere in what's happening in Syria, taking advantage of this, security vacuum. At certain points, Syrian fighters that belonged to a more organized Free Syria army back, I would say, 2011, 2012, even into 2013. And let me remind all the viewers that these were the factions that were most effective in terms of isolating ISIS and fighting ISIS until basically they got the rug pulled from underneath them.
Everybody got painted with the extremist brush.
Exactly.
Right.
And so where things are going from now, we're not very optimistic, but obviously the death of someone like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is very much welcomed by many Syrians, I would say, if not all.
Sergei Markov, can you accept that? Baghdadi was terrible. He was a terrorist leader of a horrible group that killed, mutilated, raped, did horrendous atrocities, but he was just a... you put that on silent, right? Okay, so he's a terrible leader of a terrible terror group. They killed, they raped, they did all these things, but they were merely a symptom or a manifestation of a war, and the real evil is still Assad. Can you accept that?
I'm surprised, interesting, when you and General Turkish TV will change rhetoric from Assad regime to the Syrian government. According to my prediction, it will happen in the middle of 2020.
Okay, so that style guide semantics, we'll look forward to whatever happens there, but can you answer the question, please, sir?
Yes, and of course, Baghdadi death is not so significant for the security situation in Syria. It's significant for Donald Trump very much because he now accusing United States for the betrayal of Kurds and for giving up the position, United American position in Syria, and the Russia taking control of the American role in Syria.
Okay.
So for Donald Trump was very important to give some response. So, and he, I think, asked to kill al-Baghdadi, kill his security.
Right.
But also everybody knows that Daesh is more a network organization, but not so much a centralized army.
Right.
And Daesh have been destroyed on 90% by, first of all, by Russia, Russian aviation and Syrian army. And I should remember you that before Russia starting real war against Daesh, Daesh growing. And only after Russia had been involved, Daesh growing down.
Okay, so let me ask Murat Aslan if that's true. Okay, so let me ask Murat Aslan if that's true. Murat Aslan, the Russians were the game changers, and that perhaps Daesh wouldn't have been all but defeated, at least in its territory, and now their leader wouldn't be dead if it wasn't for the Russians defeating them mostly along the way. Is that accurate?
Actually, Russia is a fact in Syrian theater because after Russia intervened to Syrian ground, we know that all dynamics had changed and still it's changing. But on the other hand, there is another reality. Daesh has grown up without any, interference of Russia or the United States or Syria, but the dynamics that was a reality in Iraq and Syria, and enjoy the ground in two different countries and enjoy the popular support. That's reality. On the other hand, we know that there was an overall suppression of Daesh in Syria and in Iraq,
right?
And it's a result of overall efforts of all countries. Turkey did so, and Russia did so.
Right.
But we have to care not only Daesh, but the root causes and also probable outcomes after yesterday's incident, Baghdadi's kill.
Right. Let me bring in Dave Jonas. Dave Jonas, undoubtedly seen as a win for President Donald Trump. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi killed, perhaps not of the same symbolism as somebody like bin Laden, right, who attacked America on home soil, killed 3,000 people and so on, but still seen as a victory. Is it seen as a bookend for the United States to get out of Syria now?
To some extent, I think so. I think that's a very good point. I like your bookend analogy. And I think that one thing people don't talk about very much in this regard is that it's also a victory for the concept of Westphalian sovereignty. In other words, no one is thrilled to have al-Assad in charge of Syria and seemingly safe for now. But yet that is better than this idea of a stateless terrorist entity controlling land and acting like a state when they're not a sovereign entity. So I think it's a victory on any number of levels. And the other important thing here is that I think that the world is going to see very clearly the difference between what happens when the U.S. goes into an area and rebuilds roads and hospitals and takes care of people versus when the Russians go in. And it will be very interesting to see how much money they spend on the population and rebuilding.
Okay, and we'll get a response from Sergei Markov in a moment. But I want to ask you, Yaser, when you hear that from Dave Jonas, he's talking about realpolitik here. A lot of these nations have thought, okay, well, Assad might have done a lot of terrible things, but he doesn't want to attack us in our home countries. He's not exporting an ideology. He's not blowing up people in subways and on streets of Western capitals or Istanbul even or elsewhere. Therefore, he's a less bad choice, and we'll deal with him maybe later, but we need to stop imminent terror threats. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I don't know when the Western order is going to come to terms with the, realities of this realpolitik that is very engaged in this very immediate, very short-term, non-strategic type of view. I mean, look at what's happening in Lebanon right now. Look what's happening in Iraq. Look at what's been happening in terms of the waves of protests throughout the Arab world. This is an indication that the security situation, the political situation, and based on it, the security situation in the Middle East and North African region is just not sustainable. When you have a regime such as the regime of Bashar al-Assad, someone who is a mass criminal and someone who has deeply destabilized the region prior to 2011, prior to the waves of these revolutions. I mean, look at his behavior and the behavior of his regime throughout the first decades of the 2000s after the American invasion in Iraq. How did he react to it? The types of direct and indirect support that he's done to terrorist groups to destabilize societies and destabilize certain things. And so we have to go back to the root causes. We cannot ignore that anymore.
Okay, so Dave Jonas, is this then a problem merely deferred to a later date rather than a problem solved?
That's a great question also. Obviously, the Middle East is full of problems, and there's been a lot of accusations about President Trump abandoning the Kurds, and that's particularly a troublesome allegation, but it's also false. I think there is I'd like to paraphrase, Lord Palmerston, I think, who said nations don't have friends, they have interests. And at some point, America has to focus on its own problems. We've been in the Middle East for years. Our military is getting worn out, and it's time to move on. The Kurds understand this. The Kurds didn't fight with us because they think we're so great. They fought with us because it was aligned with their interests at the time. They understand that our interests have changed, and it's time for us to move out. They're big boys. They can take care of themselves. They should have their own state. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 gave them essentially a state, but Turkey abrogated that treaty, and they don't have a state. I do hope there's a way that they get a state in the future at some point.
Murat Aslan, is Turkey interested anymore in bringing broader peace and stability to Syria? If it gets its safe zone, is it satisfied? Does it not care anymore or as much as it used to in the past about a future democratic Syrian state and so on? Because a lot of people are seeing everybody's competing interests are just getting what they can for themselves, no more, no less. That's where we're at in this war.
I think what you have done is a clear proof of what you will do. And Syrian case is a significant one that you can easily observe the actors' behavior in the way either to build a stable and secure Syria or to divide it in tiers. What Turkey did until now is to establish a secure zone, to secure the borders, to eradicate the terror threat over there, and also facilitate immigrants to go back. And after the military interventions, for instance, Azaz and Elbab, Turkey encouraged local administrations to improve themselves in a sustainable manner. And now Turkey is at the lowest profile, but the local councils. On the other hand, latest agreements between Turkey and Russia and the United States clearly limits Turkey's ability to build or occupy a land, but establish a status quo.
I see.
And what Turkey expects is to facilitate a political process in Genova. That means there is a kind of chain that is linked, each other.
Right.
And this chain will go to democracy if all parties agree.
Okay.
That's what Turkey expects in the region.
Okay, and in a few moments, I'm going to ask Yaser Tabbara how much faith he has in that process. Dave Jonas, this is where we thank you. We're going to mix it up a little bit now. We thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers once again. Always a pleasure, sir. Let's bring in Peter Eltzoff in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's an international affairs professor at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. So, Peter, Turkey gets a safe zone. The Americans get their win in killing the ISIS leader, and Russia gets the whole Middle East. Is that what's happening?
Well, I would make a conclusion that it gets the whole Middle East. And then I would also say it's not Russia, it's Putin. Because Russia today is all about Putin. And when he goes, the situation may change. I would even argue that Russia had never had a political system which was even not under Stalin, which is so much dependent on one man. But yes, for the time being, Russia has become a very powerful player in the Middle East. There is no question, and particularly the last visit to Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi showed that Putin's visit. So, I mean, for the time being, it's going to play a very significant role there.
Sergei Markov, Russia is the main player, especially with regards Syria right now? Is that how you see it?
And usually in the normal country, foreign policy, usually responsibility is the leader of the state, president or prime minister. And Russia is normal country. And we have no parliament who is blocking foreign policy of the president, as we can see in United States, where chaos as a result come to power. And also it's very important, Russian President Vladimir Putin fully control Russian militaries and security intelligence service community. It's also, from our point of view, much more better than what we could see in the United States and partly in Great Britain, where intelligence security community now get out of control of the political institution. It doing what they're doing. We know that they cooperated with so-called white helms, and white helms cooperated with terrorists in Syria, and also United States security community support and organize the coup in Ukraine. They overthrown democratically elected president, and they base this on the neo-Nazi groups, which is now
let me ask
part
Peter,
of the power in the Ukraine illegal government.
Peter Elsoff, what we've heard from Sergei Markov is sort of par for the course, as they say. I've heard this characterization of the situation very often, besides the issues of, Congress hampering presidents and so on in the United States and elsewhere. This idea of Russia's place in the Middle East and how it is far superior than what the Americans are doing elsewhere. Tell me if that is representative of a changing Russian foreign policy or just an extension of Putin?
Well, there are several comments I would like to make, to particular what Mr. Markov said. I mean, first of all, the Congress is not blocking the decisions. We have a separation of power. And what he was talking, I don't know what he meant by a normal country where one man runs the show, basically a deeply authoritarian state. And what Russia calls a deep state in the United States is in reality the tradition of a separation of powers and independence of those separate branches of power. I mean, the United States, for the time being, yes, is withdrawing from Syria, and I think it didn't start with Donald Trump. It started with Obama when he drew the red line and then basically gave away to Putin. But again, I would emphasize it may be a very temporary situation, but if a foreign policy depends on one man in Russia and the whole power, the pyramid of power, we may see tremendous changes after Putin goes. We may see witness something what happened after the death of Stalin. So we don't know what's going to happen to Russia. For the time being in Syria, yes, and for America, it's probably, as the previous speaker actually was talking, I mean, it makes sense probably at this point to withdraw from Syria, and the Kurds can take care of themselves. It's unfair. It might be unfair to Kurds, of course, and it's perceived by many in the United States that President Trump betrayed his allies.
Right. Let's bring in Yaser Tabbara again. So Yaser Tabbara, there's a lot of hope in a process, right? We heard from Murat Aslan as well. There's hope of a process that might have started in Astana, and then there's a chat in Sochi, and now there's hopes that this can breathe new life into a new Geneva process. President Erdogan, Vladimir Putin getting together, deciding what's best for their own interests, but also looking for what's best for the country of Syria and the Syrian people. Do you have any trust in that process?
I mean, there's a lot of that process to be seen, obviously. I mean, going back to sort of the geopolitical picture and sort of going back to what you're saying in terms of everyone acting on behalf of their own interest. I mean, it just makes sense that sometimes interests are aligned with the Syrian people and sometimes they're not. And here I would say, the political ambitions or the political interest of these countries are not necessarily aligned sometimes with us as Syrian people. I mean, it seems like actually all geopolitical actors are not working towards a strategy. They're working towards immediate gains. But for perhaps laughably Iran, actually. I mean, Iran is the country that is looking at this from a long-term perspective. And we're the ones who are paying the price for all of that. What we want is, at the end of the day, an alternative, sustainable governance system that basically, reestablishes a semblance of order, a semblance of security, a semblance of a respect for local governance, which we see as the main tool to deconstruct tyranny and deconstruct corruption, deconstruct oppression, which we've seen in Syria for decades. And I think that is the recipe for a long-term sustainability in terms of security, in terms of prosperity, and in terms of also benefiting the immediate neighbors to the north and to the east as well.
Okay, Murat Aslan, there's less than a minute left on the program, so I'm going to ask this very quickly. The level of cooperation needed in killing Baghdadi extended from Washington to Ankara and to Moscow as well. Is that a good thing?
It depends. As you know, Turkey has always been in cooperation with the United States in terms of intelligence and also in some circumstances operations. I don't know anything about Russian cooperation, but Turks tolerated what the United States had done yesterday. So that's the issue. The second thing, we do not know what had been achieved on the ground yet, even though Trump announced it, because as you know, we don't have any picture of Baghdadi.
Right.
And another issue, I think we should focus on counter-radicalization rather than the killing of Baghdadi, because we had witnessed Zarqawi, Masri, Baghdadi, and we will face another one in future.
Right.
Once you kill them, you will face another one.
Yep, it's what they
So
call
the
a game
issue
of
is
whack-a-mole.
counter-radicalization,
Right.
not killing anybody.
And that's
Okay,
why, and that's why you need to
Solve the root causes.
rely on local partners to actually solve that issue.
Okay, I'm over time. So, gentlemen, I would have loved to have carried on, but I've got to wrap. I thank you all for joining us here on this episode of The Newsmakers.